Hi all, it's PJ with Montevilla Sewing Centers. This video is on household sewing machine needle. We're going to start with needle anatomy. This is the front view and the side view of a needle. Up at the top we've got the butt, and then the shank, the blade, the long groove, the eye, the point, and the tip. And then if you look at the side view, you've got the scarf, which is on the back side of the needle just above the eye. With household sewing needles, the back of the shank is flat, and the flat side goes away from you when you're putting your needle into the machine. Choosing a needle. You're going to want to choose your needle based on the type and the weight of thread and your fabric. The goal is to have the needle slide easily through the fabric without damaging the fibers or creating too large a hole, and to carry the thread smoothly without damage. A couple rules of thumb. The needle size is based on the thread weight. The thicker the thread, the larger the needle. The type of needle is based on the type of thread and the type of fabric. I've got some examples listed down here. For knit fabrics, you're going to want to use a ballpoint or a jersey needle. Microfiber, you're going to want to use sharps or microtex. I'll go into more detail on these when we get into the individual needle types. If you would like a quick way to know which needle to use, there are a couple of apps that can help you with that. There's also a web-based program. Schmetz and Floriani both have needle apps, and they're both for Apple and Android devices. And then also on the Class A needle site, they have a great item that's called a needle matchmaker. You need to have access to the internet to be able to use that because it is web-based, but it's great. You put in your project type, the fabric type, the thread type, and the thread weight, and it will then tell you which needle you should be using. It's really quite handy. Because thread weight helps determine needle size, here is a quick explanation of thread weight. Thread measurements. Thread generally is measured by weight, although it can also be measured by length, but most commonly by weight. The thread weight is determined by how many meters it takes to weigh 1 gram. The higher the number, the finer the threads. Here's an example for you. Standard embroidery thread, which is fairly fine, is a 40 weight. That means it's 40 meters to weigh 1 gram. A heavy decorative thread, like the Wonder Filled, the Razzle Dazzle, and Sizzle, which a lot of times are used either in bobbin work or in serger. They can be used in loopers or couching. That's an 8 weight. That means that it takes 8 meters to weigh 1 gram. In the thread video, I'll go into much more detail on that. Here's why you need to know the thread size. The top picture, the thread is too large for the groove of the needle. So the groove of the needle is there to help protect the thread as it's going in and out of the fabric. The middle picture is a good relation between the thread and the needle. The bottom picture, the needle is actually too large for the thread. What can happen is the thread could bounce around and you could get loops in your stitches. Needle sizes. Why are there two numbers, 7511, 8012, 9014? The short answer is that the larger number is the European sizing and the smaller number is the American sizing. I'm going to let you read the fine print all on your own, but basically the European number is an actual measurement of the blade of the needle. In needles, the higher the number, the larger the needle. And yes, that is opposite of thread because they couldn't make that easy. This shows the different eyes of the needles, and there is a difference. If any of you have ever taken any of my classes and I'll say something about a needle size and I'll say a 9014 top stitch needle, and it's almost always followed by, and the top stitch is important. And the reason is the eye of the needle. So up at the top, the universal needle is kind of the standard needle eye. The embroidery needles have a slightly wider eye. It gives a little bit more room for the embroidery thread to go through. Oftentimes embroidery is sewn at a very high speed, so having just slightly larger eye will be able to keep the thread cooler as it's passing through the eye all those times. And then the metallic and the top stitch, you can see here, it's a quite elongated eye. And again, it's to give that thread more room to move through. With metallic threads, they tend to not be quite as flexible as a standard thread. So the larger eye keeps that process going smoother, and with top stitch threads are usually thicker. Needle types, point shapes, and tips. Does it really make a difference what needle I use? Yes, it does. Why the point shape and tips are important. The point shape and tip affects how the needle penetrates the fabric or material when stitching. Using the incorrect needle can cause flagging or deflection of the fabric, which can cause skipped stitches. The next section explores specific needles, the points, and the tips. These are Class A needles, and this is a really nice graphic that shows you the different point shapes. If you compare, say, the sharp with the embroidery needle, the point shape of the sharp is quite different than an embroidery needle. Specific needles. This is a fairly new product, the non-stick or the anti-glue needles. Class A calls theirs anti-glue. Schmetz, they're the super universal. They both have a non-stick surface, and these needles are designed specifically to work with the tacky stabilizers, and they work quite well. This is just a graphic showing again the different needle points and tips. So we just talked about the anti-glue. The ballpoint or jersey needle, of course all companies don't name their needles the same thing, but generally speaking they have the same types of needles. So it's really important to just look at the packaging and read it if you're trying to get a specific type of needle. So the reason that you want to use a ballpoint or a jersey needle, if you're sewing on knits, whether you're sewing or serging or embroidering, you should be using a jersey or ballpoint needle. The reason for this is you don't want the tip of that needle to break any of the loops on the knit. If you use a sharp needle, it could actually break one of the threads of the knit, and then you would get a run. Generally, you're not going to want that to happen. Knits, jersey or ballpoint needle. The embroidery needle we talked about a little bit before with the eye. It's got a slightly wider eye and slightly elongated as well. And again, it's just to allow a little more space for that embroidery thread to move through because it's generally going at a pretty high rate of speed. The jeans or denim needle is tapered down towards the point from the blade. It tapers down to the point. Generally speaking, denim is pretty stiff and sturdy, so having that taper helps the needle go through the fabric. The leather needle. A leather needle should be used on real leather. You don't want to use a leather needle on synthetic leathers or synthetic suedes because the tip of that has an actual cutting blade on it. And if you were to pull the seam on a synthetic, it would basically just tear out. Here's a little graphic that is very common in industrial needles. They'll show this. On the Schmetz site, they do show it as well with their leather needles. And it shows that it's got a cutting tip. This graphic literally shows the slit. And again, that's because that's the leather needle. There's an actual knife at the end of that that's cutting. So this graphic is what is used for just a standard sharp point. And you can see there's a hole. When it pierces the fabric, it leaves a hole. This one is the symbol that they use for a ballpoint, meaning that it's creating a hole, but it's moving the fibers aside and it doesn't actually cut them. The metallic needle, again, has a longer eye to give more room for the metallic thread to go through. Also, generally, it's going to have a very mild ballpoint so that it doesn't cut into any pre-existing stitches that are the metallic thread. The quilting needle is long and tapered, and again, it's designed not necessarily for piecing, although you could use it for piecing, but it's really designed for the actual quilting, going through multiple layers of fabric and the batting. And then the sharps or microtext, this is the one that's got the most dramatic point shape. And again, this is to go through very, very tightly woven microtext materials. When microtext first started on the market, there was a lot of trouble with a lot of skip stitches because the fabric is so tightly woven, the needle point would literally bounce off. This has a very sharp and acute point. The stretch needles are designed for materials containing lycra, and also they're ideal for sewing elastic on. The top stitch needle, honestly, top stitch needle is probably my favorite needle. I don't sew on a lot of knits. I do mostly quilting cottons. And so for me, a top stitch needle works great. And I generally use a 90-14. It's not too big, it's not too small. It's kind of the gold, to me, it's the Goldilocks of needles. And the top stitch, because I oftentimes use 12 weight thread, and to be honest, I'm too lazy to change my needle all the time. So years ago, I attended a seminar with the people from Superior Thread, and they were talking, and apparently they did a poll of all of their international teachers and said, what's your favorite needle? And apparently, resoundingly, the answer was a 90-14 top stitch. So apparently I'm not alone. And then finally, the universal needle. And the universal needle is exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of the jack of all trades. It will work for an awful lot of things, and to be quite honest, if you are sewing and you're getting a nice good stitch, you're not getting skip stitches, and you're using the universal needle, I would stick with that. All of the other needles really do have a purpose, and they will make a difference in your projects. But if you really don't want to deal with tons of different needles, you can try the universal. It is good at a lot of things, but it is not perfect at any of them. In the video description below, there will be a link to the needles and thread reference list. This has a ton of links on it for all kinds of useful information from the needle companies and also the thread companies. It's a great source of information. Up next, part 2, specialty needles, packaging, and storage.